On January 1st, the U.S. Treasury hit a hard ceiling, $36 trillion in national debt, triggering emergency maneuvers never meant to last. Every hour, America spends $3 billion more than it takes in. The countdown has started. If Congress stalls, the world's largest economy faces a real shutdown and possible default within months. But how did a simple law become a trillion-dollar time bomb? The debt ceiling traces its roots to 1917, when Congress passed the Second Liberty Bond Act. Before that, every new government bond required a separate vote. The new law aimed to streamline wartime borrowing, giving the Treasury Department more flexibility while keeping Congress in the loop. Instead of approving each loan, lawmakers set an overall cap, a single number that limited total federal borrowing. This was never meant to control spending. It simply made the process more manageable as the nation's finances grew more complex. Over the next century, that cap has been changed nearly 80 times. Sometimes it has been raised, sometimes suspended, sometimes revised with new rules. Through the 1960s and the 1970s, adjusting the ceiling was considered routine, a technical step that happened quietly, often with little debate. But as deficits grew and political divisions sharpened, the vote became a high-profile moment, a chance for lawmakers to demand concessions or draw attention to fiscal concerns. It is important to understand what the debt ceiling actually does. Raising it does not create new government programs or authorize fresh spending. Instead, it lets the Treasury pay bills that Congress has already approved. Failing to lift the cap does not cut future deficits. It just blocks payment on existing obligations. That distinction is at the heart of every modern standoff, as the limit moves from an administrative tool to a political flashpoint. In the summer of 2011, the debt ceiling debate stopped being a technical argument in Washington and became a global alarm. For the first time in history, the United States came within days of missing payments on its debt. The world's largest economy was suddenly at the mercy of a political standoff. As lawmakers traded demands and deadlines, markets watched with growing anxiety. On August 5, 2011, Standard & Poor's stripped the United States of its AAA credit rating, downgrading it to AA+. The agency cited not just the size of America's debt, but the visible dysfunction in Congress and the lack of a credible plan to address long-term deficits. The reaction was swift and punishing. In a matter of days, global stock markets lost more than $2 trillion in value. Investors scrambled for safety, volatility spiked, and the cost of borrowing edged higher for the Treasury. The Government Accountability Office later estimated that the 2011 brinkmanship alone forced taxpayers to pay an extra $1.3 billion in interest that year. The downgrade was a warning shot. Even the hint of default could shake the foundations of the world's reserve currency. Standard & Poor's decision made one thing clear. America's creditworthiness was not just about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about the willingness of its leaders to govern responsibly. The debt ceiling was no longer just a legal cap. It had become a loaded weapon, capable of rattling markets and undermining faith in the United States financial system. Once the debt ceiling locks in, the Treasury Department turns to a set of accounting maneuvers known as extraordinary measures. These tools have been part of the government's emergency kit since 1985, when officials first used them to buy time during a standoff. The largest lever is the G Fund, a federal retirement account for millions of government workers. By suspending new investments in the G Fund, Treasury can free up nearly $300 billion in borrowing room. This does not take money away from retirees. The law requires the government to make these accounts whole once the crisis passes. Another tool is the Exchange Stabilization Fund, originally set up in the 1930s to manage currency markets. By pausing reinvestments here, Treasury gains about $20 billion more in headroom. These steps, combined with a handful of smaller maneuvers, like suspending certain state and local government securities, can collectively unlock $400 to $500 billion in temporary borrowing capacity. Each measure is a stopgap, not a solution. Treasury staff track every dollar, knowing that the available room shrinks with each day's spending. Once these options run out, the government's ability to pay bills on time depends entirely on the cash left in the account. The countdown to the X date, when funds are exhausted, begins the moment these extraordinary measures are set in motion. Every day after January 21st, 2025, the Treasury's available cash ticks down. With the debt ceiling locked at $36.1 trillion, every payment, from Social Security checks to military salaries and bond interest, draws from a shrinking pool. Extraordinary measures buy time, but the clock is set. Analysts at the Bipartisan Policy Center in the Congressional Budget Office circle dates on the calendar mid-July, August, maybe early October. The exact moment the money runs out, what insiders call the X date, depends on unpredictable flows. April brings the biggest wild card. Tax season can deliver a windfall or a disappointment. In a strong year, hundreds of billions in IRS receipts can stretch the timeline, buying weeks of breathing room. A weak tax season, though, shortens the fuse. Even a modest shortfall can pull the X date forward by a month or more, catching lawmakers off guard. Markets tend to ignore the warnings at first. For months, Treasury auctions go off without a hitch. But as summer approaches and the X date window narrows, nerves begin to fray. Traders watch daily cash reports, looking for signs of strain. Volatility rises, borrowing costs inch up, and the risk of miscalculation becomes harder to ignore. The buffer shrinks with each passing week, turning a technical problem into a political standoff with real economic consequences. Inside the House of Representatives, a handful of hardline conservatives hold the cards. With only a razor-thin majority, party leaders can't afford to lose even a few votes. The most vocal bloc is demanding deep, immediate spending cuts, hundreds of billions of dollars a year over the next decade, before agreeing to any increase in the government's borrowing limit. Those demands echo the confrontations of 2011 and 2023, when similar groups used the debt ceiling as leverage for sweeping budget reductions. Leadership faces a dilemma: accede to these demands and risk a Senate rejection, or try to pass a clean increase and face rebellion from within. The calendar only adds pressure. Every week closer to the X date raises the risk that even a minor miscalculation could trigger a shutdown or worse. With primary elections looming and every vote under a microscope, the threat from just a few holdouts becomes magnified. The standoff isn't just about numbers. It is about who controls the future direction of fiscal policy and who will be blamed if the clock runs out. A TSA agent watches the clock tick past midnight, knowing her next paycheck may not arrive. In a shutdown, hundreds of thousands of federal workers like her are suddenly caught in limbo, some sent home without pay, others forced to keep vital systems running on nothing but promises of back pay. During the last major shutdown, roughly 800,000 civilian employees were furloughed, while law enforcement, air traffic controllers, and border agents worked without pay for weeks. Each day the government stalls, the economic hit piles up. Private sector analysts warn that the cost can reach into the billions of dollars daily as contracts freeze, small businesses miss payments, and families delay spending. But a shutdown is only part of the threat. If the debt ceiling is not raised in time, and the U.S. defaults, the shockwaves would reach every corner of the economy. Moody's projects that a true default could wipe out trillions in household wealth, with stock markets dropping 20 to 30%, and the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, nearly 60% of global reserves, suddenly up for debate. Each hour brings another risk, credit rating agencies watching from afar, ready to downgrade U.S. debt the moment Congress falters. For workers, retirees, and investors, the cost is not just measured in dollars, it is trust, stability, and the promise that the system will hold. Trillions of dollars now hang on a single congressional standoff, with global markets watching every move. The world's reserve currency depends on faith that brinkmanship will not cross the line. In 2025, that trust faces its hardest test yet. The stakes are not abstract. They are your mortgage, your job, your future.